What if the British lost the 7 Years' War? What if the British had lost the 7 Years' War? What if, in the forests of the Ohio Valley and the coasts of Bengal, fate had turned its gaze away from London and toward Versailles? Would America even exist as we know it? Would India speak English? Would the sun ever rise on a British Empire that never came to be? To answer that, we must begin in the world that was. In 1756, Europe caught fire in what would become the first truly global war, the 7 Years' War. Born of imperial rivalry and dynastic ambition, it dragged nearly every European power into a maelstrom of shifting alliances and scorched earth campaigns. But it was outside of Europe, in the thick jungles of India, the vast forests of North America, the Caribbean Sea, and the Atlantic trade routes, that the true stakes of empire were tested. Historically, Britain emerged triumphant. Under William Pitt, the Elder's leadership, Britain poured money into its navy, subsidized Prussian forces on the continent, and struck hard where France was vulnerable, in its overseas colonies. Quebec fell in 1759. French power in India was broken. And by the Treaty of Paris in 1763, Britain had become the world's dominant colonial power. But now, let us imagine one single divergence, not in the halls of Versailles, but in the muddy banks of the St. Lawrence River. Imagine the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, 1759. Historically, General James Wolfe led a daring attack that broke French lines outside Quebec, mortally wounding both himself and his opponent, the Marquis de Montcalm. But what if Wolfe had hesitated? What if French reinforcements had arrived in time? In this alternate timeline, Montcalm holds the high ground. Quebec City remains in French hands. The British are repelled and forced to retreat, their hold on Canada slowly slipping as French and native forces rally together in a counteroffensive. Suddenly, the war in North America, the so-called French and Indian War, tilts in favor of France. Fort Duquesne is retaken, French alliances with native tribes strengthen, and British colonial militias, demoralized by defeat and lacking consistent support from London, begin to fracture. Meanwhile, in India, another thread unravels. Historically, Robert Clive's stunning victory at Plassey in 1757 opened the gates of Bengal to the East India Company. But what if Mir Jafar, the conspirator Clive relied on, had not betrayed his Nawab? What if the French had fortified their position at Chandernagore and reinforced their fleet before the monsoon? In our altered timeline, Clive is killed in the field. The company falters. French influence in India surges. By 1762, the balance of power has reversed. France, with its overseas possessions intact, negotiates from a position of strength. Britain, overstretched and weakened by mounting debt and political infighting, sues for peace. The Treaty of Vienna, not Paris, ends the war. France retains Canada, regains lost territory in India, and restores much of its Caribbean holdings. Britain loses its foothold in Bengal and retreats to coastal trade enclaves. The British Empire, once poised to stretch across the globe, is abruptly contained. But the real story, the more dangerous and transformative one, begins after the guns fall silent. For in this new world, the American colonies remain hemmed in by French territory. The colonial frontier ends not at the Mississippi, but at the Appalachians. Trade is taxed by two empires now, British and French. And resentment in the 13 colonies grows not toward a single distant king, but toward the reality of being caught in the jaws of two. In the next chapter, we enter a North America unlike any that ever existed, where French forts dot the Ohio Valley, and English settlers stare across a cultural and military fault line, and where the idea of American independence might be stillborn or far more explosive. In the year 1770, North America stands divided, not between revolution and loyalty, but between empires. To the east, the British colonies cling to the Atlantic, hemmed in by a long spine of French forts stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Quebec is vibrant and expanding, its fur trade flourishing, its Catholic clergy protected by Versailles. Louisiana grows from a forgotten swamp into a strategic jewel, a buffer between the British tide and the Spanish frontier. The Mississippi is not a highway for manifest destiny, but a border. In this world, the dream of westward expansion, of a free American republic stretching from sea to shining sea, never takes shape, not yet. The proclamation line of Cent 63, once a British gesture to pacify native lands, now becomes a hard international boundary. The colonists can see French banners flying beyond the ridgelines. They know what lies over the horizon, and that they cannot touch it. The British government, reeling from defeat, shifts inward. The war left them impoverished and cautious. Without the spoils of victory, without Canada, without Bengal, without new revenue streams, Parliament tightens its grip on the colonies. Taxes rise, naval patrols double. The colonies must now pay not just for the British army stationed among them, but for a war they lost. But rebellion simmers differently here. In our real timeline, the American Revolution was as much a rejection of imperial overreach as it was an assertion of independence. But in this alternate world, the colonies are not simply victims of British taxation. They are pawns caught in a global rivalry. To the north and west, French forts beam with muskets and cannons. To the south, Spanish rule stretches through Florida and into the Caribbean. Britain is no longer the overbearing tyrant. It is the weakened protector. Resented, yes, but necessary. Still, discontent burns. Boston merchants chafe under tariffs. Virginia planters lose profits as their western land grants vanish under French occupation. Rumors spread that France is enticing native tribes to rise again, that Quebec plans to annex the Ohio Valley, that Jesuit agents are stirring Catholic insurrection in Maryland. And yet, there is no clear path to rebellion. Not without unity, not with two great empires poised to divide the continent. The colonists understand this. So do men like Benjamin Franklin, who once dreamt of a united British America. In this darker mirror of our history, Franklin does not sail to Paris to beg for French aid. He stays in Philadelphia, trying to broker an impossible unity between cautious loyalists, angry merchants, and frightened farmers. Then comes a spark. In 1772, a skirmish breaks out in the Mohawk Valley. A group of British colonists, frustrated by French patrols in what they claim are ancestral lands, fire on a trading post flying the fleur-de-lis. Several are killed. The French governor in Quebec declares the act a violation of the Treaty of Vienna. British troops, under pressure from colonial governors, march west to support the settlers. France responds. It sends a regiment south from Montreal, not as an invasion, but as a protective presence. Suddenly, the frontier is ablaze again. But this is not the American Revolution. Not yet. This is something more complex, a colonial proxy war between fading powers. The colonies are no longer fighting for liberty alone, but for space to breathe. And in this new world, the price of independence may be higher, bloodier, and far more uncertain. Next, we journey into the crucible of conflict, where Virginia militiamen face off against French grenadiers in the shadow of the Alleghenies, and where a young, ambitious officer named George Washington must choose not just a side, but a future. In the winter of 1773, Virginia was cold, restless, and bracing for war. Along the frontier, colonial militias were being raised not in rebellion against the crown, but to protect British settlers from French encroachment. Yet in this twisted reality, the lines of loyalty were already starting to blur. Among the officers summoned to lead this swelling defense was a young man already marked by both talent and failure, George Washington. In our real timeline, Washington had fought for the British during the French and Indian War, and his early missteps helped ignite the global conflict. But here, in a world where France had emerged victorious and British influence had waned, Washington's world had changed. The Virginia House of Burgesses viewed him not just as a commander, but as a symbol of what colonial leadership might become. Tall, composed, and ambitious, Washington saw what others feared to speak aloud, that Britain could no longer guarantee the colony's future, not with France expanding its influence from the Great Lakes to the Gulf, not with Parliament choking the colony's economy to feed its own wounded empire. And so, Washington marched west, not with redcoats at his side, but with militia from the Shenandoah Valley and men from the Piedmont farms, armed with muskets and the quiet desperation of people who saw their way of life slipping away. They met the French at a narrow pass near Fort Cumberland, where icy ridges rose like broken bones from the forest. The French force was small, sent not to invade, but to observe and deter. But a single gunshot, fired in the fog by a nervous colonist, changed everything. The skirmish that followed was brief, confused, and brutal. When it ended, 12 French soldiers lay dead, including a young officer from Quebec whose family held sway in Versailles. The rest were taken prisoner. The incident sent shockwaves through the continent. Versailles accused the British of breaking the Treaty of Vienna. London, desperate to avoid another full-scale war it could not afford, disavowed the militia's actions. And Washington? He was recalled to Williamsburg in disgrace. But among the colonists, he was becoming something more dangerous than a soldier. He was becoming a hero. In Boston and Charleston, in taverns and meeting halls, whispers spread. France controls our borders. Britain taxes our trade. Who will defend the colonies if not our own? The idea of independence had not yet taken form, but the belief that London was powerless and Paris too dangerous was spreading like fire on dry timber. Meanwhile, France hardened its position. The Marquis de Lafayette, still a young noble with dreams of glory, was dispatched to New France, not to fight, but to observe, to charm, and to prepare. Versailles had no desire for war, but it had every desire to keep the British colonies in check. French Jesuits reasserted their presence among native nations. Alliances were reforged. French engineers began to rebuild old forts, using stone instead of timber. The colonies watched and waited. They saw the trap tightening. In Philadelphia, Benjamin Franklin called for a Continental Assembly, not to declare independence, but to establish a common colonial defense. It was an unprecedented act. No such assembly had existed before, not even in rebellion. Delegates came reluctantly, suspicious of one another. New England distrusted the South. New York feared the repercussions of defying Britain. But fear of France, fear of being swallowed piece by piece, bound them, and in that smoky chamber, amid debate and accusation, a new idea was born. Not a republic, not yet, but a league, a continental league, one that would coordinate militias, fortify roads, build defenses, and negotiate as a bloc with London. To the British government, it was illegal. To the French, it was provocative. To the colonists, it was the first breath of something older than empire and newer than revolution. And to George Washington, watching from Mount Vernon, nursing both his wounded pride and rising hope, it was a signal that history might still be bent to his will. Next, we follow Washington into the shadows of revolution, where loyalty turns to ambition, and ambition into destiny. By the summer of 1774, the tension across the American colonies was no longer a quiet murmur. It was thunder beneath the surface. Trade was stalling. Militia drills echoed in village fields, and everywhere the question loomed larger: how long before this powder keg explodes? In London, Parliament viewed the Continental League with suspicion and dread. It was not yet rebellion, not officially, but it was dangerously close. A body of colonies, coordinating defense without royal approval, sounded less like a partnership and more like a prelude to secession. But Britain, humiliated in war and teetering on financial collapse, lacked both the political will and the military resources to act decisively. Instead, they sent letters, warnings, threats, offers of compromise laced with veiled ultimatums. They demanded the dissolution of the League. They offered limited self-governance in exchange for loyalty to the crown. But the colonies had tasted cooperation, and the smell of their own strength was intoxicating. Meanwhile, in New France, Lafayette had begun writing reports that alarmed his superiors. "The Americans," he wrote, "are not the fractured dependents we believed. They are forming something new, something united, and in that unity lies danger." Versailles, cautious and burned by past overreach, urged patience. Do not provoke, the king's ministers warned. Contain. But on the ground, containment was unraveling. The skirmishes along the frontier had never truly ended. French patrols clashed with Virginian militias over disputed logging sites and fur roads. Mohawk and Shawnee warriors, drawn into the widening conflict, launched raids against British settlers, claiming they were defending treaties made with France. In response, colonial newspapers ran blood-soaked headlines blaming papist aggression, stoking ancient fears of Catholic tyranny and foreign rule. Into this rising storm stepped George Washington once more. He had remained in semi-exile after his recall, watching as the League gathered strength. But Franklin, always the pragmatist, knew Washington's reputation still held power among the southern colonies, and perhaps more importantly, among the militias. And so, Washington was summoned again, not to fight, but to organize. In Williamsburg, he took the oath as commander of the Continental League's Provisional Defense Forces. It was not yet an army, and he was not yet a general, but the symbolism was unmistakable. Here stood a man not appointed by London, not beholden to Parliament, but chosen by the colonies. And in his acceptance speech, short and grave, Washington said the words that would echo far beyond the chamber. "We are not yet rebels, but we will not kneel to two kings." With those 13 words, the road to war shortened. France interpreted the speech as a threat. British authorities interpreted it as treason. And the colonies, weary of bowing to distant powers, now emboldened by unity, began preparing for the unthinkable. In Quebec, French forces doubled their presence near Lake Champlain. New Orleans braced for revolt among its growing Anglo-speaking population. Spain, watching from afar, began secretly supplying arms to the League, not out of loyalty, but out of fear that France might dominate the continent if America fell into chaos. And yet, even amid this growing geopolitical storm, there were those who still believed peace was possible. Franklin, aging and brilliant, proposed a radical idea, a tri-imperial conference. He called for a summit between Britain, France, and representatives of the Continental League to redraw the map, to codify colonial autonomy, and to prevent what he called a war that would consume all sons of the Atlantic. But the world was not ready for such diplomacy. In early 1775, as delegates debated in Philadelphia, a small band of Virginia militiamen stumbled upon a French convoy carrying artillery through contested territory near Fort Pitt. Fearing an imminent invasion, they attacked without orders. The French soldiers resisted fiercely, but were overwhelmed. Dozens died. The French flag was pulled down, and in its place, for the first time, flew a new banner, stitched by local women. 13 stars, arranged in a circle, on a blue field. It was not yet the flag of the United States, not officially, but it was enough. Versailles declared the act an open rebellion. Britain, cornered and embarrassed, was forced to denounce the colonies, even as it lacked the means to stop them. The colonies, though still fractured in purpose and vision, now faced a moment of no return. And in the hills of Pennsylvania, as winter melted into spring, George Washington rode with his militia toward the new borderlands, not to hold the line, but to break it. Next, we witnessed the opening volleys of a war that never happened in our world, a three-way struggle for control over the soul of a continent. Spring, 1775. The continent breathed smoke. From the frozen ridges of the Adirondacks to the bayous of Louisiana, war no longer lurked in the shadows. It had erupted. But this was not the familiar American Revolution of our textbooks. There were no crisp lines of red and blue, no singular cry for liberty from king or parliament. Instead, this was a brutal, tangled war of 3 flags and 1,000 loyalties. George Washington, now elevated to General of the Continental League forces, led a coalition not of states, but of distrustful colonies. His army was a patchwork. Massachusetts militiamen hardened by skirmishes with French irregulars, Virginian frontiersmen with personal scores to settle, even sympathizers from British Canada who sought freedom from both crowns. Their enemy? It wasn't clear-cut. In the north, French regiments marched south from Quebec, fortified by native allies and Jesuit scouts who knew every hidden path through the forests. In the east, British forces began landing troops in New York Harbor, belatedly and reluctantly. London had finally committed soldiers, but too few, too late, and under generals more loyal to their pensions than to strategy. In the early months, neither foreign empire aimed to conquer. France wanted to hold its territorial gains and punish the colonists for defying the Treaty of Vienna. Britain wanted to restore order without provoking total rebellion. But the Continental League, no longer just a defensive pact, had grown teeth. And it was now biting at both. Washington's first campaign struck at the heart of this triangle, the Hudson Corridor. The plan was bold: cut a path through British-controlled New York, sever French supply lines from Canada, and establish a buffer zone between the two empires. It was, in theory, brilliant. In practice, it was blood and mud. At the Battle of Saratoga Plains, not the same as our world's Saratoga, Washington's forces clashed with a combined detachment of French regulars and British Marines. The French wore blue, the British red, and the colonial militias, whatever they could find. The chaos was total. Fog covered the hills. Gunpowder turned the air black. Drums, once used to signal flanks, were drowned in screams. Washington, ever the pragmatist, fought not for symbolic victory, but for terrain. By the end of 3 days, the League held the high ground, but at a horrific cost. Over 2,000 lay dead or dying. Entire regiments of New Hampshire men were gone. Washington's left flank was shattered. He ordered a tactical withdrawal, not as defeat, but as a bitter reminder. This war would not be won quickly, or cleanly. Back in Europe, the response was mixed. France saw the League's resilience and grew nervous. Versailles began considering a radical option: open negotiation with the League itself, bypassing Britain entirely. It was a dangerous proposition. Recognizing a quasi-independent colonial entity could shatter the fragile imperial system. Britain, humiliated by the League's success against both its enemies and itself, descended into parliamentary chaos. Whigs demanded recognition of colonial rights. Tories called for full military intervention. The king, weakened and aging, struggled to unify a country that no longer controlled its destiny abroad. But within the colonies, something deeper was taking root. In taverns and churches, in public squares and private letters, the idea of nationhood began to flicker. Not just independence from Britain, not just resistance to French occupation, but an entirely new identity, forged not from language or crown, but from necessity. The war had forced Virginia to stand beside Massachusetts, forced Presbyterians to defend Catholics, forced planters to fight alongside sailors. It was messy. It was imperfect. But it was real. And at its center stood Washington, no longer just a soldier, but a symbol. In his headquarters near Albany, he wrote a letter to Franklin, now leading diplomatic efforts abroad. The words were spare, but haunting. "We are fighting not for borders, but for breath. If we do not create a country now, we may never again have the chance to be anything but property." Franklin, ever the chess player, saw the opportunity. He began covert talks in Amsterdam, whispering to Dutch bankers and Prussian envoys about loans, recognition, and a future republic in the New World. The League, once seen as a colonial nuisance, was now being treated, cautiously, as a nation in embryo. But as the snows of 1775 began to fall again, a new storm was coming. For in New Orleans, a rogue French general had seized control of the port, declared the southern colonies under protection of France, and issued a proclamation. All slaves who fled British or League control would be granted freedom and arms. A civil war was about to become something far more combustible, a revolution of class, race, and empire. Next, we descend into the fire as the American struggle becomes a war not just of nations, but of liberation. New Orleans, winter of 1776. Once a sleepy colonial outpost at the mouth of the Mississippi, it had now become the epicenter of a dangerous idea that liberty, once whispered in parlors and pamphlets, might be extended not just to landowners and lawyers, but to the enslaved. General Jean-Baptiste Fournier, a minor French noble with radical ideas and a bruised ego, had grown impatient with Versailles' caution. Sent to reinforce the southern frontier and contain Anglo rebellion, he instead seized the port, expelled British merchants, and made an audacious proclamation. To all who are held in bondage, rise, join the French cause, and you shall be free. It was a spark hurled into a forest of dry timber. Within weeks, word of Fournier's decree spread through Georgia and the Carolinas. Slave quarters buzzed with rumors. Plantation owners, already unnerved by war and tax riots, now faced the specter of a Southern uprising. In Charleston, a group of freedmen attempted to march on a British garrison, waving makeshift tricolors. They were cut down. In Savannah, Loyalist militias clashed with suspected sympathizers in brutal nighttime raids. The British were horrified, the French were divided, and the Continental League, still unsure whether it fought for reform or revolution, found itself caught in a moral and strategic vice. Washington, ever the stoic commander, understood the military implications immediately. If France armed and trained escaped slaves en masse, it would gain a vast, motivated force and destabilize the southern colonies beyond repair. Yet, to suppress such movements entirely would risk losing the very principles the League claimed to uphold. Franklin, writing from The Hague, warned of the contradiction. If we speak of freedom while denying it to those in chains, our republic is born poisoned. But others, particularly Southern delegates, saw Fournier's actions as a betrayal, an invasion not just of territory, but of hierarchy. The war fractured anew. The Continental League split along a quiet, dangerous fault line. In the North, whispers of abolitionist militias emerged. In Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, leaders began debating limited emancipation, not from moral awakening, but military necessity. In the South, however, militias redoubled patrols, banned French literature, and began forming their own counter-revolutionary committees. In this chaos, another figure emerged, a woman history nearly forgot. A former slave from Saint-Domingue, smuggled into New Orleans and educated in secret by Jesuits, Marianne Etienne had risen through Fournier's ranks as a translator and liaison. But in 1776, she became more than an aide. She became a voice. Using pamphlets, public sermons, and fiery speeches in the French quarter, she reframed the war in radical terms. Not a squabble between kings, but a reckoning of humanity itself. The empires, she said, are all dying. Let something new be born. Not English, not French, but just. To many, she was a prophet. To others, a threat more dangerous than any army. By summer, New Orleans was no longer just a French stronghold. It was a symbol, and symbols attract enemies. British forces from Jamaica landed to the south. Loyalist militias marched from Georgia. And Washington, after intense debate, authorized a detachment of League troops, led by a reluctant Virginian named Thomas Jefferson, to secure the Mississippi corridor. Jefferson, torn between his Enlightenment ideals and his plantation reality, arrived at New Orleans to find not a military base, but a revolution in motion. Black soldiers drilling beside white Frenchmen, women reading pamphlets in the open square, children reciting slogans not of king or country, but of liberty untethered. He wrote in his journal, "I have seen the future, and it terrifies me." The siege of New Orleans began in September. It was brutal and confused. No side held the moral high ground. The British bombarded the city indiscriminately. The League surrounded it, unsure whether to destroy or preserve it. Inside, Fournier's garrison fought it alongside freedmen and local volunteers, inspired less by orders than by the sheer refusal to surrender. The siege lasted 32 days. When it ended, the French surrendered not to the British nor to the League, but to the people. Fournier was captured, tried by his own officers for insubordination, and executed. But Etienne escaped, her whereabouts unknown, her name already turning into legend. The city smoldered, its banners torn, but its message unbroken. Across the colonies, fear spread, and with it, resolve. For the first time, the idea of independence became irreversible. No empire could hold this continent now. The question was no longer if the colonies would break free, but what kind of nation they would build. Next, we enter the darkest year yet, as civil war ignites within revolution, and the dream of unity begins to bleed. The year was 1777, and the revolution, if it could still be called one, was eating itself. New Orleans had not fallen to enemy fire, but to ideology. What had begun as a war of borders had now split into something deeper, more volatile, a war of meanings, of futures, of who freedom was truly for. In the aftermath of the siege, the Continental League found itself staring into a mirror and not liking what it saw. The unity that once held 13 colonies together under threat from France and Britain was cracking along old familiar lines. Southern delegates accused their northern counterparts of sympathizing with abolitionist rebels. Northerners accused the South of dragging them into a moral quagmire. The dream of a single, new nation, a republic forged from necessity, was now under siege from within. In Virginia, militia leaders refused to fight alongside units rumored to have freedmen in their ranks. In New York, anti-French riots broke out after rumors spread that League envoys were negotiating with radicals in Canada to open a second front. Even in the Continental Congress, still a fragile, unofficial body, shouting matches replaced debate. Washington, ever the soldier, tried to remain above the fray. But his position was now unbearable. His army was splintering, supplies were inconsistent, morale was faltering, and his officers, some loyal to abolitionist ideals, others to plantation interests, no longer trusted each other. Victory had never felt farther away. Then came the Charleston Uprising, sparked by whispers of a second emancipation movement. Enslaved people in South Carolina seized weapons from a loyalist storehouse and took control of several coastal plantations. The rebellion spread like lightning. British forces rushed in, hoping to exploit the chaos, not to liberate, but to restore order. League forces hesitated, torn between sympathy and fear of total collapse. In the end, it was Washington who acted. He sent troops, not to crush the rebellion, but to stabilize the city before the British could fully claim it. He offered amnesty to those who surrendered and promised in writing that freedom earned in arms will be honored by the new republic. It was the first time the word republic had been written in any official League dispatch. That single sentence split the colonies even further. Southern newspapers denounced it as betrayal. In Richmond, effigies of Washington were burned by former allies. In Boston, however, crowds cheered, calling him the American Cincinnatus. The League's vision, once blurry but shared, was now polarizing into two incompatible futures, one of inclusive liberty and one of cautious independence built on old hierarchies. Franklin, watching from abroad, sensed the shift. His mission to secure foreign recognition had stalled. France was fracturing under its own contradictions, pulled between Enlightenment philosophers and entrenched aristocracy. Britain, though weakened, began hinting at reconciliation. A proposal emerged. The colonies would receive full dominion status under the British Crown, modeled after Ireland, self-governing but loyal. It was tempting. Many in the South leapt at the idea. Better the devil you know, they reasoned, than a republic ruled by dreamers and radicals. A Dominion of America could preserve local control, protect property, and stop the revolution before it spiraled further. Washington, Franklin, and their circle debated fiercely. Could a compromise with the old empire preserve the ideals being born? Or would it merely place new chains in gilded frames? Then came the letter that shattered all hope of compromise. It arrived from Haiti. Marianne Etienne, thought dead or vanished, had resurfaced. She had led a successful rebellion in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, driving out both French garrisons and plantation owners. Her declaration was brief, incendiary, and addressed not to Versailles, but to the free peoples of the New World. There is no freedom where slavery lives. There is no nation without all its people. To the radicals of the North, it was a call to arms. To the elites of the South, it was a declaration of war. The League splintered. Some states, like Pennsylvania and Rhode Island, began drafting their own constitutions with clauses abolishing slavery. Others, like Georgia and South Carolina, declared themselves independent of the League, seeking protection under a new treaty with Britain. It was not a revolution anymore. It was a civil war, inside a civil war. In one fiery session, Franklin wrote what might have been the most honest line of the age. "We began this struggle with 13 clocks. We believed they would strike as one. Now I fear they may never strike again." And yet, amid the chaos, a few still dreamed of unity. A final Congress was called, in Philadelphia, of course, not to declare independence, but to redefine it, to choose what kind of republic, if any, would rise from this broken battlefield. Next, we enter that last desperate winter. As the League fractures, empires close in, and Washington must decide, unity at any cost or justice without it? Winter fell early in 1778, burying Philadelphia under a blanket of snow and silence. Inside Independence Hall, candles flickered weakly, illuminating faces worn thin by years of war. The delegates gathered here knew this was likely their final meeting, not because victory was near, but because unity was slipping from their grasp entirely. Washington arrived late, his uniform ragged, his boots muddied from days spent riding between divided militias. His presence commanded respect, yet even he could sense a strange distance now. Men who once admired him whispered behind his back, wary of what he represented. A fight that had become too complicated, too costly. At the center of the debate lay a single word: freedom. But it meant something vastly different depending on who spoke it. Southern delegates argued passionately for reconciliation with Britain under Dominion status, which would protect their plantations and traditional way of life. Northern representatives pushed just as fiercely for a republic untainted by slavery, believing compromise meant moral surrender. The room echoed with shouting matches that lasted late into the night. At one point, Alexander Hamilton, a young delegate from New York, stood and asked bluntly, "Is our revolution so fragile that it must collapse beneath the weight of its own contradictions?" His question lingered unanswered. Meanwhile, France watched hungrily from Quebec. Though fractured by internal debate, Versailles recognized the colony's divisions as an opportunity. Rumors circulated that the French might soon move southward, under the guise of restoring order. Of course. Back in Europe, Benjamin Franklin, desperate to save his fledgling nation, sought alliances wherever he could. He found quiet sympathy, but little concrete support. European monarchies were intrigued by American ideas, but terrified of their consequences. Only the Dutch Republic showed willingness to secretly lend money, sensing an opportunity for profit rather than principle. On the southern frontier, British forces slowly regained ground, recapturing Charleston and Savannah. Loyalist militias swelled, bolstered by promises of protection from upheaval. To the north, Canadian militias loyal to France skirmished daily with League troops in a grinding war of attrition. Everywhere, the once unified colonies fought not just foreign enemies, but each other. At Valley Forge, soldiers starved. Supplies were stolen or diverted by corrupt officials. Desertion rates soared. Washington watched as his dream of freedom, of unity, bled out slowly in the winter mud. Then, in the darkest days of January, news came from the south. A large French force had crossed the Appalachian Mountains, capturing strategic passes and isolating League forces. Panic spread rapidly. If the French secured the Ohio Valley, the colonies would be irreversibly split, the revolution crushed between two empires. In Philadelphia, the debate reached fever pitch. Some delegates called for unconditional surrender to Britain, hoping at least to preserve their homes, their fortunes. Others urged fighting to the bitter end, declaring that surrender would forever betray those who had already given their lives. Finally, Washington rose, and the chamber fell silent. He spoke slowly, his voice heavy but resolute. "We began this war fighting for a vision. Imperfect, yes. Contradictory, undoubtedly. But at its heart was hope. If we surrender now, we extinguish not just our hopes, but those of every generation after us. Whatever freedom means, we will not find it kneeling before kings." His words rang through the hall, piercing even the hardest hearts. But unity remained elusive. Delegates returned home divided, committed to fighting separately or negotiating independently. The Continental League was effectively no more. Washington retreated once again to Valley Forge, knowing the next spring would be decisive. He called upon every soldier willing to follow him, not for league, colony, or ideology, but for survival itself. In that bitter cold, a new army slowly took shape, smaller, hardened, and fiercely loyal only to the man who stood among them, sharing their suffering. That same winter, far away in Haiti, Marianne Etienne wrote a letter that reached Washington by secret courier. It was brief and poignant. "You fight not just for your land, General, but for an idea greater than yourself. Do not fail it." Washington kept the letter close. His fight had become personal, not just against Britain or France, but against despair itself. As the snow began to thaw, scouts brought grim news. French troops had fortified their position along the Ohio River. The British, emboldened by colonial divisions, prepared to retake New England. Washington knew his next move would decide everything. Yet he also understood, perhaps better than anyone, that even victory would not restore what had been lost. The colonies, once bound by necessity, had chosen separate paths. Even if he defeated every enemy, the country he had dreamed of might never exist. And still, he marched forward, toward one last chance, one final battle to salvage something from the wreckage of revolution. Next, we enter the desperate climax as Washington leads his troops into the heart of darkness, a battle where victory or defeat might both mean ruin. Spring, 1779. The thaw brought warmth, but not relief. In the heartland of America, near the muddy banks of the Ohio River, thousands of men stood poised on the edge of history. It was here, amid towering oaks and dense mist, that the fate of the continent would be decided. On one side, the Continental forces, ragged yet resolute, their numbers thinned but their spirit sharpened by years of hardship. At their head rode George Washington, older than his years, haunted by battles lost and opportunities squandered, yet driven by the quiet belief that this fight was one he could not, must not lose. Opposing him, an uneasy alliance had formed. French troops under General Henri Montclair and British regulars led by General Charles Cornwallis. Both commanders distrusted each other deeply, bound only by a shared desire to break the colonial rebellion once and for all. Washington knew the terrain intimately, having fought here years earlier in another war, one that seemed a lifetime ago. He chose his position carefully, settling atop a wooded ridge near Fort Henry, overlooking the wide bend of the river below. It was defensible, but if defeat came, there would be no escape. As dawn broke on the morning of April 20th, the mist cleared slowly, revealing the approaching enemy armies. British soldiers marched in tight columns, their red uniforms stark against the green landscape. French regiments advanced in orderly rows, their blue coats and white banners catching the early sunlight. Washington's heart tightened. He had fought many battles, yet none felt heavier than this. He turned briefly to his aide, Alexander Hamilton, and uttered words that would later become legend. "If today is our end, let us make it worthy of remembrance." The battle began fiercely. Artillery fire echoed across the valley, each blast shattering the peaceful morning. British troops charged first, disciplined and relentless. League soldiers, concealed among trees and ridges, fired volleys, then faded back. Men fell, blood mingling with mud, smoke rising thickly. Then came the French assault, more cautious, deliberate, but just as deadly. DC-8. Montclair was a shrewd tactician, aware that time and numbers favored him. He pressed slowly, forcing Washington's exhausted forces into tighter formations, their ammunition dwindling rapidly. Hours passed, and Washington's lines began to falter. The enemy's artillery pounded mercilessly. Men dropped in clusters, screams mingling with shouted orders. Hamilton begged Washington to retreat, to save what little remained of the army. But Washington held firm, his gaze fixed grimly ahead. Then, as hope seemed utterly lost, a distant sound pierced through the chaos, a rhythmic drumming from the western hills, growing louder. Soldiers on both sides hesitated, bewildered. French and British commanders glanced nervously toward the sound, uncertain of what new force approached. Emerging from the tree line appeared hundreds, then thousands, of warriors, Shawnee, Mohawk, and Seneca tribes, led not by French or British officers, but by native leaders who had grown tired of being pawns in colonial games. Among them rode a familiar figure, Marianne Etienne, returned from Haiti, her presence both unexpected and galvanizing. In one shocking moment, the native forces surged, not toward Washington, but into the flank of the French-British lines. Etienne had rallied the tribes not in allegiance to any empire, but in defiance of them all. Her message, powerful and simple, resonated far beyond New Orleans. This land belongs neither to kings nor colonies. It belongs to those who live free upon it. Confusion erupted among British and French ranks. Command broke down as allies turned on each other, panicked by the sudden reversal. Washington seized the chance immediately, ordering a full counterattack. His soldiers surged downhill with renewed vigor, shouting not in English, not in defiance of Britain, but with cries for freedom itself. By sunset, the battle was over. British and French forces scattered into retreat, leaving Washington stunned yet victorious on the bloody fields of Ohio. Etienne and the native warriors had vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving behind only whispers and legends. In the days following, news of Washington's improbable victory spread quickly, sparking renewed hope across the colonies. Yet victory had not brought unity, only the chance at it. The colonies still lay fractured, mistrustful of each other's intentions. Washington, weary yet resolute, sent letters urgently to all colonial leaders, calling once more for reconciliation, for unity forged not from fear but from purpose. He knew now more than ever that the real battle wasn't over territory or even empire, but over whether America's revolution could truly birth something lasting. As summer approached, delegates slowly returned to Philadelphia, shaken by the near collapse of their dream, yet drawn by Washington's plea. They gathered once more in the sweltering hall where it all began, determined finally to answer the question that had haunted their revolution from the start. Could a nation truly rise from the ashes of empire, or were they destined forever to be defined by divisions deeper than any king? In the fragile months following the battle along the Ohio River, the colonies grappled desperately with the meaning of their unexpected victory. Defeating the British and French had seemed impossible, yet now, in victory's uncertain shadow, the real struggle began. Delegates once again converged on Philadelphia, weary but driven by an urgency greater than any war. The city, scarred by riots and divided loyalties, was now quiet, waiting, breath held, for what would emerge from behind the closed doors of Independence Hall. Washington, gaunt and solemn, opened the proceedings with a voice heavy from years of carrying a burden few understood. His message was stark, direct. We stand now at the edge of two futures, one united, imperfect but free, or one divided, where each state stands alone against empires eager to reclaim us. History offers no third path. The debates began anew, passionate and raw. Men who had fought side by side now confronted the very fears that had split them apart. Southern delegates insisted any union must respect their property, including slavery, or they would rather walk alone into the uncertain embrace of British dominion. Northern leaders, haunted by Marianne Etienne's words and the alliances forged with native tribes, declared any nation founded upon oppression would be doomed from its inception. Benjamin Franklin, fragile yet sharp-minded, returned from Europe to find his beloved colonies closer to collapse than unity. Observing the heated exchanges he penned privately, "We are like sailors adrift, arguing over the map while the ship fills with water." Yet he knew the colonies had no choice. Unity was survival. In a dramatic moment, Franklin called upon Washington privately. Late at night, the two weary men sat beside a single flickering candle. Franklin spoke softly. "General, they listen to you. If anyone can bridge this chasm, it must be you." Washington hesitated. He had spent his life avoiding politics, preferring the simplicity of battlefield command. But he understood the stakes. Without unity now, the sacrifices of thousands would vanish into history's dustbin. The next morning, Washington stood before the assembly, his silence commanding instant respect. He held a short letter written by Marianne Etienne, delivered anonymously to him only days earlier. He began quietly, "There is one voice missing today, yet it speaks louder than ours. A voice born not from privilege but from chains. Marianne Etienne reminds us, freedom is not divisible. It is either for all or it is nothing." Murmurs spread through the hall. Southern delegates shifted uncomfortably. Northerners watched closely, sensing a historic turning point. Washington continued, his tone even but firm. "Our revolution was ignited by injustice, sustained by sacrifice, and nearly destroyed by division. The world watches to see if we can rise above our differences and honor what we began, not just for ourselves, but for future generations." He paused, his voice cracking with emotion. "But let there be no illusion. A nation founded upon contradictions will collapse under their weight. Our choice today defines us forever." Silence fell heavily over the hall. Delegates wrestled with their consciences, hearts caught between principle and pragmatism. Finally, Thomas Jefferson rose, a Virginian planter himself, the weight of contradiction evident in his troubled eyes. "If we form a union now, it must be built honestly. Let slavery diminish over time. Let it fade from our land. Our children's children must inherit freedom, not chains." A compromise emerged, imperfect yet profound. Gradual emancipation. Northern states would abolish slavery immediately. Southern states would commit to gradual freedom over a generation, giving the nation time to adapt economically and culturally. It satisfied no one completely, yet it offered a path forward. Within days, the delegates drafted a document unlike any seen before, an agreement born not from king or conqueror, but from fragile trust and shared necessity. They called it simply the Articles of Union, a humble acknowledgement of how much healing remained. The news spread quickly, sparking both celebrations and outrage. In Charleston and Savannah, bitter protests erupted. In Boston and New York, joyous crowds filled the streets, hopeful yet wary of what lay ahead. Washington knew unity remained precarious. Yet, as he watched the first signatures affixed to the document, hope stirred gently within him once more. On a distant shore, Marianne Etienne received the news quietly, thoughtfully. Her revolution had not ended oppression overnight, yet it had sparked something profound. She whispered softly, echoing across the sea, "Perhaps now we can finally begin." As winter approached again, a new flag rose quietly over Independence Hall. 13 stars, bound tightly in a circle, unbroken, though still fragile. But in London and Versailles, eyes narrowed in suspicion, watching carefully. Empires do not easily surrender their dreams, and across the mountains and rivers, tribes who had saved the colonies wondered bitterly if their sacrifices would be remembered or forgotten. Washington knew this fledgling union would soon face tests even greater than war. He sensed, deep down, that the hardest battles, against division, injustice, and betrayal, still awaited. Yet for now, at least, they had chosen unity over isolation. They had dared to build a nation upon hope, however uncertain and incomplete. Next, we move toward the final reflections of this story. What kind of America had emerged from these flames? And could it truly survive the storms still gathering on every horizon? In the years that followed the fragile unity forged in Philadelphia, the world watched cautiously, waiting for the strange experiment born from the wreckage of empires to either thrive or collapse. This America was unlike any that had existed before. It was neither fully revolutionary nor completely conservative, neither entirely free nor wholly enslaved. It bore scars of contradiction, dreams mingled with harsh compromises, yet it stood, improbable and defiant, against expectations of kings and philosophers alike. George Washington, having led armies and inspired nations, retired quietly to Mount Vernon, deeply aware that his country was still unfinished, still burdened by internal divisions. He lived out his days planting orchards, repairing fences, and hoping quietly that history would be kinder to this new republic than it had been to the empires it replaced. In the North, freedom expanded rapidly. Town squares echoed with vibrant debate, factories rose along riverbanks, and commerce flourished. Immigrants poured in from Europe, seeking lives unfettered by the Old World's constraints. Yet beneath the surface, inequality lingered, fueled by wealth and status, a reminder that liberty alone did not ensure justice. In the South, change came slowly, often painfully. The promise of gradual emancipation was honored unevenly, triggering decades of tension and quiet resentment. Yet slowly, inexorably, plantations turned into farms, slaves into free laborers, though the wounds of centuries healed at a glacial pace, if at all. Across the Appalachians, native tribes who had turned battles once stood as allies, now found themselves sidelined. Treaties forged hastily in gratitude were broken casually in peace. Marianne Etienne, having returned briefly to Haiti, continued to inspire movements of liberation across the Caribbean and beyond, yet she never saw the full promise of freedom realized. She became legend more than woman, her story whispered in secret circles as proof that change, however improbable, was always possible. In Europe, the echoes of America's strange and turbulent revolution reverberated powerfully. France, weakened by colonial overreach and divided by internal strife, slid slowly toward revolution itself. Versailles, desperate to prevent collapse, scrambled to preserve its empire, but found that the tides of history had already turned. Britain, chastened by its losses, embraced cautious reform, abandoning the dream of endless empire for stability closer to home. The world that emerged from America's fractured rebellion was neither stable nor predictable. Nations watched carefully, learning new lessons about liberty, unity, and the true cost of empire. The continent had chosen to navigate contradictions rather than resolve them, and that choice would shape global history profoundly. Yet the question remained, had America succeeded or failed? It was a nation that had risen from the ashes of imperial conflict, formed by necessity, forged by contradiction, and bound by fragile hopes. It had faced invasions, revolts, betrayals, and internal schisms, emerging scarred but standing. Yet, could such a nation ever truly heal? Could it genuinely embody freedom while carrying within itself the seeds of compromise? Years later, a young historian stood on the banks of the Ohio River, the place where a nation nearly died, where 3 empires had fought, and where thousands perished for visions of liberty. As he gazed across the quiet waters, he penned these thoughts. Our history teaches us that freedom is never final, never fully won. Each generation must renew the promise or see it fade. America was not built once and forever, but built, broken, and rebuilt 1,000 times. Today, we have imagined one simple twist of fate, a battle lost instead of won, and followed its consequences into a world both familiar and strange. A world where America struggled with deeper contradictions, where independence was harder earned, and unity far more fragile. Yet perhaps the most profound lesson lies not in how different that America might be, but in how clearly it reveals the delicate threads holding our own world together. What if Britain had lost the 7 Years' War? Would the world that emerged, a world of messy compromises and uneasy alliances, be one worth living in? Would you want to live in such an America, complicated yet courageous, flawed yet fiercely hopeful? Or does it teach us that history is not merely what was, but a constant reminder of what might yet be? We leave you with these thoughts and invite you to ponder them deeply. For the past is never truly past. It lives within every choice we make today. What do you think would have happened had history followed this different path? Could America survive such contradictions, or would it fracture irreparably? Let us know your thoughts below. Join the conversation, share your reflections, and consider subscribing for more explorations of history's greatest what-ifs. Because sometimes, the smallest change can rewrite the entire world. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Until next time, keep questioning, keep imagining, and keep exploring the infinite worlds that history might have created. So there we have it, an alternate world born from a single twist of fate. A world where Britain's defeat reshaped the continents, shattered empires, and set America on a path both darker and more complicated than our own. This America, forged from division and compromise, stood defiantly between liberty and contradiction, justice and convenience. It's a place where the revolution never fully ended, where freedom was both a promise and a question unanswered. But now we turn it to you. Would you want to live in this version of history? Could a nation built upon such profound contradictions endure, or would it inevitably tear itself apart? And perhaps more importantly, if history had taken this path, would the ideals we hold today still survive? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us what alternate history you'd like to explore next. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into history's greatest what-ifs. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and never stop imagining how the world could have been different.